etc. Very good. Okay, I'd like to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Drescher. We are very pleased to welcome her. She is a professor at the Santa Clara University, which is a private Jesuit university in Santa Clara. Her background, she was born in Virginia, raised in Pennsylvania. She got of course, she had an undergraduate degree, and then she got a master's degree in systematic theology at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, which is a Catholic university. Then she got a PhD in what is called Christian spirituality from something called the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, which I didn't know, but now I know, is a consortium of private theological schools in Berkeley. Any further questions, direct them to Dr. Drescher, please. What do I know? All right, so now she is a professor of religious studies at Santa Clara University here in Santa Clara. She teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in religious studies and quite a broad spectrum of religious studies, all the way from different religions. She focused on the United States, however, not international. And she teaches about the different religions in the United States and non-religion in the United States. She actually teaches a course on atheism in America, which sounds like my kind of course. She directs something called the Living Religion Collaborative, and Dr. Drescher explained to me, she can do it better than me, but she explained that the concept of this collaborative is that people, just because you say you're a Catholic or you say you're an atheist or you say you're whatever religion, doesn't tell you much about that person's actual life and the way they live their religion or non-religion and everything else about them. So the Living Religion Collaborative deals with how people's real lives are, which includes their religious perspective, okay? And one more thing I meant, what did I mean to add? Okay, she has written a book, which I'm dying to read, which is called Choosing Our Religion, The Spiritual Lives of America's Nones, N-O-N-E-S, nuns, which means us, people who answer the Pew Research Survey saying, I am none of the above. I am not associated with any religion. And her current research is on what she calls religious cosmopolitanism. The atheist community of San Jose is very happy to welcome Dr. Drescher. Please welcome her with me.
Thank you. I'm hoping you can hear me because I'm coming back from, I'm off 3 classes today, just finished up with Atheism in America before I got here today. And in moments I'll have slides. It's lovely to meet you all and to be here this evening. Voila. So I'm going to have to hop over here from time to time. You'll just have to bear with that. So some of you, that's okay. Awesome. Some of you may be aware of some research that popped out about a year and a half ago on chimpanzee communities. And it was very controversial research, continues to be. Some evolutionary anthropologists were studying primates in Africa, and they had, I think, 6 or 8 different tribes of chimpanzees that they were studying. Chimpanzees have distinct cultures in each of their tribal groups, but they also have some shared practices, of course, that chimpanzees would do. So when they notice things that all of the chimpanzees are doing, if you're an evolutionary anthropologist, which I am not, but if you are one of those, you look at, well, what's the evolutionary value of this practice to the community? Does it help with selecting a mate? Is it help with reproduction? Does it help to gathering food? Does it help in fending off enemies? All of those things that would contribute to the thriving of a tribal culture. So they found in all of these cultures, in all of these different tribes, which actually didn't have any intermingling, so they weren't influencing each other, they knew that. They found this peculiar practice. Every once in a while, one of the chimpanzees would get up in the middle of dinner, and just walk over to that tree over there. And below that tree, there was a pile of stones, cairns of rocks, that are very common in early humanoid settlements. If you go to the big island of Hawaii, you'll find them on some of the lava plains there. They're in Africa, Australia, all over. And there's long been a big anthropological debate about whether those are religious markers or perhaps something else. And it varies from, are they marking some holy place, or are they just counting like births and deaths, right? So you can take different perspectives. So it was interesting to them that the chimpanzees had these cairns that were very like this, and that they hadn't seemed to learn it from each other, that it was, it came up sui generously in all of the communities of chimpanzees. So anyway, the chimpanzee gets up in the middle of the day, in the middle of dinner, I'm tired of my roast beef, I'm going to walk over here, and they pick up a stone from the cairn and they heave it at the trees. And they dance ecstatically. They jump and scream and dance ecstatically, right? And so the controversy around this is that a couple of the researchers published an article in the journal Nature, which is a highly regarded journal, and they said that they thought this could represent a proto-spirituality, a sense of something inherent to all primates that is celebrating these special trees or some kind of ecstatic experience, cultivating that. And that raised a ruckus, right? As you might imagine, in the scientific community. Because, of course, no one can ask the chimpanzees to write down really or even talk about sign, how they feel about this experience, what it means to them. Are their beliefs based into it? In it? Is it just a sensate experience they're having? It's an interesting case study because it raises this question of whether we look at certain behaviors and we map religious meanings onto them, or whether religion is some kind of essential, inherent quality in people. And in my work over the last few years, I've been looking at, I don't know what the chimpanzees are doing. I'm not a evolutionary anthropologist. The two people who published that article have way rolled that back over the last year to say that might be a possibility, but it could also be that they've heard something, somebody heard first, and they do this to send an alarm to people. It could be lots of other things. I don't know the conclusion of it. But I do know that in this culture at this particular moment, the way in which we mark something as religious or not religious is consequential. Makes a big difference over time. And right now, we're in this place where people are marking their non-religion in profoundly different ways than they have done for generations. So you're probably all familiar with this data about the religiously unaffiliated, that people who answer none when you ask them with what religion they identify or with what they affiliate. And we know that since 1990, there's been this huge jump, particularly in people under age 30 who identify as non-religious in some form. Part of that, Judy and I were just talking about this, part of this has to do with the structure of survey questions. If being religious, identifying as some kind of religion is your only choice, then you're going to maybe pick something. So some of the surveying methods have changed. But there's still, a growth in this that's attention grabbing, that says something about the role of religion in the United States, what it means, and in people's lives. So I was kind of curious about that. And the thing about the data is that it's pretty consistent everywhere. This part of the country, and especially as you get to what's called the none zone for a long time, the Pacific Northwest, are somewhat saturated with the godless, right? With the unbelievers. So growth is slower, but it's everywhere else in the country. In fact, the fastest growing rate of religious unaffiliation, still the most religious part of the country, is in the Deep South. They are also the people who stream 50 Shades of Grey more than any other part of the country. I don't know what that's about, but, right? So everywhere in the country, religious unaffiliation is growing, and in places that are the most religious, it is growing the most. They're still more religious than other parts, but it's growing faster there. So something is afoot, right? And so I started to look at, I study spirituality, that is. I study how it is people cultivate and express some kind of engagement with what they think of as a spirit, whether that's a supernatural spirit, a cosmic spirit, a human spirit. How do people do that? So I'm interested in that. So this data, made me start asking questions about, well, is this like a new kind of spirituality or religiosity? Are people losing their religion? Are they losing spirituality, or something else happened? And so first I looked at the data that it compares nones with what I came to call somes, people who still have some religion. And what I found was it's not remarkably different, actually. So when surveys like Pew or Gallup or the GSS, the General Social Survey, ask about belief in God or a higher power or a life force, people who say none say they believe in that at a lower level than do the somes. When they ask, do you attend religious services, people who say they are nones do it at a lower rate than somes. But you'll note on there I have what I call the Hansen correction. A guy named Kirk Hansen and a woman named Penny Hadler did a study some years ago, and what they found was that when you ask people, do you attend religious services, they say, yep, I do. I do it every week, every other week, whatever. But when you actually compare that, churches and other religious organizations are really good at counting people. So when you look at the church rolls, it's off by about a third to a half, depending on where it is. So your churchy ones are a little bit fibbers by half. Which raises the question of when they're professing a belief in God or a higher power, a life force, what's the fibber rate on that, right? So even though they show things as being somewhat different, maybe not so much. Things like prayer, the unaffiliated tend to say they pray less frequently than do the affiliated. More recently, Pew has been asking about feelings of spiritual peace and well-being, or feelings of awe and wonder when you throw the rock at the tree, right? those are much closer numbers between the affiliated and the unaffiliated in terms of percentage. And then there's this interesting one. This comes from some research from a woman, a sociologist named Nancy Ammerman at Boston University, who looked both at the religiously unaffiliated and the affiliated across the country, different ideological spectrums, different ages, different religious and non-religious backgrounds, and said, do you feel more spiritual than religious? Exactly the same in both groups. Exactly the same. And all of this prompted me to start thinking about, well, what is it then that people are doing? Are they doing, they're just not doing religion and not doing anything that feels spiritual to them, and it's just like, you know, I'm watching the Golf Channel or whatever it is I do. You know, I'm on the leukemia walk. That's what I do, right? Or is it something else? And I started to think about, I taught for, this wasn't in my bio, but I taught for a couple years at an Episcopal seminary in Berkeley. And one of the things I knew all the time when I asked my students who were studying to be priests in the main, you know, when I said, what are the things that you find most spiritually significant in your life? Things like attending worship, studying scripture, you know, being involved in church activities, never on the list, never came up. It never came up. Once in a while, prayer would come up, eventually. And so I wanted to see whether wider communities of people had a different sense of what might count as spiritual for them if you didn't tell them that spiritual means some kind of engagement with a supernatural being or force. If you said you define it yourself, right? And so I did a bunch of focus groups, and then I did a survey in which I interesting thing, the survey. So I hadn't done one before. I'm not a sociologist, so I just have a Survey Monkey account. So I went to a sociologist and I said, well, how would I make this a valid survey? And she said, well, you know, test the questions first. Send it out to about 10 people you know. Ask them to send it out to about 10 or 20 people they know. That'll give you feedback on where people are being confused by the questions. I was like, right on. I have my Survey Monkey account. I'm good to go. I had the free version. This is excellent. So I did that, and I went away for the weekend. I came back on Sunday, having done this, and I had almost 1,100 responses to this. People had a lot to say about it. They had a lot to say about what seems spiritually significant. And at that time, on the data was showing unaffiliation at about 25%. About 25% of the people in my study said they were unaffiliated in some way, so it seemed representative. And I tested the data in some smaller samples. But what I found was, once again, the religious and the non-religious were not far off. And in particular, their spiritual engagement clustered around these 4 categories that I refer to as phyto, food, friends, and family. Enjoying time, spending time with family, spending time with friends, preparing and sharing food, spending time with pets or other animals. Those were the top on the list for both groups. It seems like the religiously affiliated love their families more. It's actually the case that they're more likely to be married, so they just can't get out of the house. Right? And that's why they like the dog a teeny bit more. Right. So the only thing that came up that would be, a traditional religious practice was prayer. That was the only practice that people said was significant that came up for both groups, and it wasn't high. It was a low number. in those cases. Other kinds of, creating and enjoying music, spending time in nature, creating and enjoying art, all kinds of physical activity, those were really important things. And what this started to make me think or make me wonder was whether, we've spent so much time looking at this category of the religious and then setting that against the non-religious, or looking at believers and setting that against non-believers, that we've missed what might be, I think, a more significant cultural change. That whatever that is that falls into this category that is between religion and non-religion, that seems to be happening across both groups. That seems to be a meaningful thing. That there's a lot of cross-pollination in terms of things that people see as spiritually significant, right? And we shouldn't be entirely surprised about that, given the way that we live our lives. One of the reasons, for example, that like 15 years ago, the Rocky Mountain states were among the most religious in the country after the Bible Belt, but they are no longer. They're among the most non-religious in the country, is because we all move a lot more. People travel more. We get jobs. We're intermingling a whole lot more than we have ever done. And we spend a lot of time with people who are differently religious or differently non-religious than we ever did in our lives, right? So if you look at the total population, and then this is looking at the mainline Protestant population, people spend lots of time in other religious settings. They spend time attending weddings and baptisms, even if they hold their noses, they're doing that. They're doing these kinds of shared ritual practice in the context of other social groups, and so they're experiencing other religions. And, once you've seen that different religions are functioning in society, generally speaking, it's hard to say they're all wrong except for mine, right? It begins to raise that as a doubt. So what we start to see is that nuns really aren't that distinct from sums in their spiritual outlooks and practices, and vice versa. Now, in that multiple religion survey that Pew did, they didn't look at, do you engage with people who are non-religious? That is not a thing that we measure, right? Do you think about things that we call your faith into question? Do you have doubts about the basic tenets of your religion? But I can tell you, much of my research was funded by invitations to speak at religious groups who are obviously horrified by this trend and would love nothing more than to find some kind of magic potion that would allow them, this is their favorite word, to capture the nuns, because who doesn't like that? I could be a wealthy person if I could come up with that, right? And the bad news for them is it's not going to happen. There's no magic potion. This is a profound and enduring cultural shift. They are not going back when they get married. They're not going back when they have children. They're not going back if there's a war. Everybody waited after 9/11. People are going to start going back up to church. It did not happen. Something is happening culturally that marks some significant shifts. And what I saw in my research, so I did the survey, and then I got some funding from the Social Science Research Council, and I interviewed, I pulled out people from the survey and invited them to participate in face-to-face interviews. So I interviewed about 100 people across the country, from Maine to Maui, did in-depth interviews with them. I will say, both in terms of religion and non-religion, Maui is deeply understudied. And if anybody knows of funding to go back there to study almost anything, I am willing to do that. So I just make a note on that. But what I saw when I was interviewing people, what I heard, and let me just say, one of the most powerful things about this research is that for people who are non-religious, nobody ever asks them how they came to be non-religious. Because there's this terrible fear, right, that it's going to be this sort of hate-mongering, hostility, anti-religious screed, right? Rather than, no, this was a story of how this unfolded in a life, right, in the context of a real lived experience. But people were grateful for that. I talked to people for hours on end, and some of them still continue to email me on a regular basis. So what I saw was, we're seeing a fairly profound cultural shift overall from modes of religiosity that are focused on propositional belief, cognitivists' understanding of religion. So we're all Descartes' baby. This is, the post-Enlightenment kind of moment where we know this happens. We know that, whatever Wednesday Descartes got up and said, I think, therefore I am, and we all started focusing not on practices, not on what people do, but on what we believe, on doctrine and dogma. Across the religious, non-religious spectrum, what we're seeing is that's not compelling for people. That's not particularly meaningful and compelling for people. People are more interested in life experiences that they engage in bodily and relational ways, right? When I say to somebody that, the time I spend every morning walking with my dog or letting her romp in the park or whatever is spiritually meaningful for me, there's not a doctrinal statement that goes behind that. That's about what my life feels like in those moments, and if I engage neighbors and all those kinds of things. So that was one key thing. The other thing that is measured a lot around religious practice are ideas of behavior. So if you believe these things, you will behave in a particular way. This believing, belonging, and behaving are kind of the cores of the study of groups in general, but religions in particular. Well, what we're finding is that people are less and less interested in rules that guide human behavior, even ethical codes, which doesn't mean they become less ethical. What they're interested in is, what are the things I have to do in the world in order to affect some kind of goodness or healing? Do I have to, like donating blood is a thing people do that has moral value. It has social value. People appreciate that. They're not as interested in saying, let me just tick off the 10 commandments, right, and make sure that works, or whatever my code is. So that was a big shift. The other thing that's, I think, really hard for, I think, people generationally, and by that I mean probably people who are over 50, maybe over 60, but also for religions, is the idea that religious or non-religious identity is not fixed. It's not an ontological trait. So when I grew up in the tiny little town of Zelienople, Pennsylvania, there was a Catholic neighborhood, a Lutheran neighborhood. The Lutherans had founded the town, so they had the fancy neighborhood. And then the Calvinists were up on a hill glaring down at everyone, or the Presbyterians, right? And you knew if you lived on Grand Street that you were probably Lutheran. If you lived on Post Street, you were probably Presbyterian. And if you lived on Pine Street, you were probably Catholic. That was encoded in your geography, and it was encoded in your identity. You might not be a good Catholic or a good Lutheran, but you had that, and it stayed with you for life, even if you stopped doing it. You might say you were a lapsed Catholic or a non-practicing Episcopalian or something like that. People aren't interested in those kinds of identity markers anymore. We're in an era of profound identity fluidity, right? We're coping with lots of differences in our lives, and the way especially people under 50 are coping with that is to start to develop provisional hybrid identities that work in different situations. Doesn't mean they're schizophrenic or anything like that, but religious identity is not something that is tattooed on the heart anymore. And that's probably the case for non-religious identity as well. When I was interviewing nuns, within the space of 1 4 or 5 hour interview, somebody would start out saying, well, you know, I'm kind of a stone cold atheist. Like, this is it. There's no God. Religion's bad. And then they'd get into the middle of it and they'd say, well, you know, I can be agnostic about that. Because when we're out doing stuff in the community, I really feel connected, and I think there is some kind of force. Or I look at my baby, or, you know, I pet the dog, or whatever. You know, maybe I'm more a humanist. Now, part of that is that the culture doesn't allow really precise language for non-religion, but part of it is this fixity of identity is less of a thing for people. And the really significant thing overall, which is not great news for churches, is that people do belonging in very different ways now. Even groups like this will feel this. We have moved from being a culture that's focused on communitarian involvement, find the identity that's like yours, find like-minded people or similar and gather with them. And that will be the most engaging space for you. Especially younger adults are finding that difference is actually the thing that draws people together. So they're much more cosmopolitan in their outlook. They're interested in engaging with people and experiences that are new and different for them. And what draws them together is that sense of it being much different than what they're used to. One of my students put it this way in a paper. He said, I'm so interested in your strange. Show me your strange, right? And that's what students ask me all the time when I'm teaching. I teach American religion and American non-religion. And in the American religion class, what they want to know about is weird religions. You know, bring on your Pastafarians, your Scientologists. They want to know about weird religion. They're not at risk of adopting any of them. They're just really curious about this. And today in my Atheism in America class, we were talking about different flavors of atheists and of non-religious people in general. And they're really curious about, well, what is it that makes somebody identify as a humanist rather than a secularist or an atheist or an agnostic, right? They're interested in that kind of difference, not in fixity. Over the summer, one of my students responded to this question about religious or non-religious identity by talking about her own hybrid identity at this point in her life. She thinks of herself as a Catholic Hindu or Hindu Catholic. Raised as Catholic, came to Santa Clara, and encountered people from Hindu communities, was really engaged by that, and is now mapping a religiosity, a spirituality that draws on both traditions. And in order to do that, she has to adapt both of them. You know, she said there are things that, you know, I don't believe in Catholicism, and there are things that I don't believe in Hinduism. And I'm going to work on making that together, that kind of knitting together of a tradition, which, you know, when I was first studying theology would have been, you know, held up as an example of scandalous syncretism. right? This evil blending, right? Well, I like a nice maritage every once in a while, right? Sometimes blending, if you're not a wine person, it's a mix of red wines that can be really, like you pick the most beautiful ones, pour them together, right? That can be really beautiful. So part of this shift toward more cosmopolitan religiosities or spiritualities has to do with feeling like I can shape something that's meaningful for me. And for this student, it wasn't particularly about beliefs. It was about there are practices in the Catholic tradition of social justice that really matter to me. And there are practices in the Hindu tradition that are deeply sensate, that engage my senses in really profound ways, and that allow me to see lots of difference and experience that I just don't get in the Catholic tradition. So if I put them together, that feels about right? And this is what I saw over and over again. One of the people I talked with in Hawaii, again in Maui, and I'd go back. If you have any questions for him, just I'll go back. But he talked about, like why once actually Judy talked about this. There's a saying in religious studies that a good religious studies class because it ruins you for religion, right? And apparently Judy had that experience. And this guy talked about, like I've come to see that there's so much wisdom in the world that it's obscene even to say pick one. That just seems, beyond credulity. That you would say, well, that seems like really good mindfulness stuff you're doing over there, but no, I don't want to know that, make that stop happening. The challenge of cosmopolitanism is that it depends on a fairly robust ability to engage with difference, even when that difference isn't engaging, even when it seems threatening, right? We have to have different strategies for engagement beyond just let's just talk about what we have in common and work on those kinds of things. We have to actually be able to discuss difference in ways that allow us to take the risk of being transformed by it. And that's really, really, really hard. That's a really hard thing. And then we have to know how to walk away. I think that one of the things that I've learned as I've talked more about this work with people in non-religious communities is that the kind of grace of non-religion, if you will, is that non-religious people have to learn how to do that, right? I mean, non-religious people are the LGBTQ people of religion, right? You have to learn how to pass. You have to learn how to negotiate, how to be present. When to come out, how to be safe. It's in an area like this that's not such a big deal, but there's a lot of learning that happens in that. If we don't do that, we continue to have these very discrete communities that are tightly boundaried. And the impact on that isn't on religion. That's not the significant thing. We're seeing it right now. When you have a narrow identity and a narrow community, and you say, our goal is tolerance, so you go have your narrow identity in that narrow community, then the practice that you share together, the cultural practice you share together, is building boundaries, is setting up walls. And that becomes a literal model for how you structure social experience. Let's build walls. Excuse me. So for some people, bridging that means acknowledging the riches of multiple traditions, even if you don't assent to their propositional beliefs. I was stunned. One of the things I asked people in the interviews about their spiritual lives, I said, well, what are your spiritual role models? Who do you turn to for guidance? Who's important? And my concern, because I'm from the East Coast, I have a very low woo-woo tolerance. I was concerned there was going to be a lot of Deepak Chopra, a lot of people who've been on Oprah or whatever. And I was trying to, I had to learn how to, really condition myself not to respond to certain kinds of things by sticking a fork through my hand, right? So, right. But that came up some. There was a lot of Bertrand Russell. There was a lot of, those kinds of things as well. But lots and lots of people said, actually, the Jesus of the gospel kind of works for me, right? Not as like the literal Son of God who literally rose from the dead and literally reigns in heaven, but as like a really powerful story. As a powerful story in the culture. And of course we allow in the United States for non-Christian religious traditions to have powerful stories that aren't true, right? I mean, we can listen to the teachings of Siddhartha or Buddha, or, whatever. But the Jesus story, hands off on that, right? So those stories were consistently really powerful for people. To say there are places in this that we can acknowledge that it has some kind of meaning for people. And that story sharing is one of those practices, I forgot about the camera, is one of those practices, and then she zoomed in, is one of those practices that begins to create a robust cosmopolitanism that can contend with difference. It's not saying, I accept the whole of your religion or your non-religion, but I get that story is really engaging and that it allows you to do certain kinds of valuable work in your life and in the world, right? We're seeing that really across the religious, non-religious spectrum, right? So one of the people I interviewed said, there's so much stuff about Christianity that I can't even begin to tell you what it means. And I said it all the time. I said it every week. I actually did this test in a church one time. I don't know if they'll ever, I'm sure they will never invite me back. But, it was after Easter, and they were saying, oh gosh, what were they saying? I just blanked on it. Sorry, it's a long day. They were saying, the Lord be with you. The Lord be with you. That's what they were saying. And I said, if a stranger came from another planet and said, what do you mean by the Lord be with you? What would you say? What does that mean? And literally nobody in that congregation could, including the priest, could answer that question. Like a lot of it just is meaningless, right? It's stuff that, so this guy's saying it doesn't mean anything in its literal sense, but I can kind of get in that Good Samaritan story that, being helped as a stranger really matters, right? And not for nothing, Pope Francis is having a very bad year. It's been a bad summer for him. I was in Ireland when he was there because we often travel together. But not true. But even he has gotten this cosmopolitanism, right? This idea that if religious people believe that their God is who their God is, let that God handle it, right? And for Francis, this was way controversial, right? Because he was saying there's no good reason for religious people not to engage with non-religious people to address the needs of the world we have right here, right now, right? And if everybody in this room is going to have a come to Jesus moment, well, okay, let's let God or not God handle that, right? That'll work itself out. So this kind of really about 3-century-old debate between those who believe and those who don't believe has begun to fray. Belief itself as a basis for identity, for belonging, for spiritual meaning has begun to fray. Now, this is the interesting thing about that. belief hasn't always been at the center of religion and non-religion. When the first Spanish explorers landed in South America in the 16th century, they encountered tribes of natives, and they wrote back, they had no religion. They had no religion. And the reason they thought they had no religion was that they looked around and they said, well, there's no churches. There are no dudes in dresses, except for us, but these are kind of minis, right? That we're really, there's none of that. There are no repeated symbols, right? What they were looking for were practices. They weren't looking for what's your book with all the stuff written down in it. They were looking for practices, and they couldn't see recognizable practices, so they thought there was no religion. They thought that, whatever they were doing, maybe with painting their bodies or ritualized chanting or stuff with smoke or doing, psychotropic plants, whatever, none of that was just weird stuff they did, right? But the interesting thing is that since the Enlightenment, we've gone away from this idea of practices that cultivate human goodness as the center of both religion and non-religion into this debate about whose beliefs are better, right? And that is, I'm just telling you, is shifting. It's going to shift both for the religious and the non-religious, which is why it's always encouraging for me when I see groups like this meeting. My students often come to groups like this to do field work, because I want them to see these are not people, having a Bill Nye, Ken Ham debate every week. These are people living their lives in the world and doing that in a way that focuses on the here and now. If there's a spirit in that, it's the human spirit that animates us, or the cosmic spirit that connects us. And there's not a particular veneration of that, but there's an honoring of that in our actions. So I think that's really the shift that we're seeing. And the challenge that we're having is learning how to articulate cosmopolitan practices that don't piss off Stephen Miller, right? Who doesn't like that word. Anyway, so that's what I've been focusing on. I'd love to hear your questions, thoughts, comments.
Just raise your hand and I will come and bring it to you. I'm going to go to him first.
So your beginning graph showing the rise of the nuns over time, I'm kind of wondering if maybe that's assuming a baseline that isn't strictly true, because I suspect that there was a big increase in religious attending church and things like that during the Cold War.
Absolutely. Yeah, so we know that when most, that we know that this is always the shocking part of the beginning of my Atheism in American class, right? When the Pilgrims come to America, we all are taught they came for religious freedom, right? The kids all know that, right? They don't know that Plymouth Plantation was like an economic concern, right? That the Pilgrims already had religious freedom in Holland. They were good. They just weren't making much bank, right? And so they came. There was no minister with them. There's no minister on the Mayflower. And there were only a small party of actual Puritans on that ship. Most of them were workers, right, who were coming over to do the fields. The Pilgrims complained all the time about how much they drank and partied and the fact that they refused to go to church. So we know that early on, most people who came here were at least religiously indifferent and often just sick of religious conflict in Europe. So as far as scholars can tell demographically, up until about the Civil War, and people worried about this, fewer than 10% of the population was affiliated with any kind of religious institution. Now, part of that was that on the frontiers, it was hard to build churches, people didn't get out there first, but also it was like, I got things to do, right? I'm, shooing Indians out of the frontier and taking over their goods, right? I gotta get that going on. That takes a whole day, right? That goes on. There's little blips after the revolution, blips up to about 20%, and it stays there for decades. Then after the war, now the popular story is after the war, people are coming back from the war, they want community, they want solace, they want to make meaning. World War II. Right? And so more people start going to church. They also start going to bowling leagues and the Elks and all of that. And that's partly true. But of course, at the same time, the Cold War begins and the communist menace raises its head, right? Right, and they are godless communists. And Eisenhower, who wasn't baptized till after he became president, self-designated most religious president in America, baptized after. Whatevs. Eisenhower says in an interview, to be American is to be religious. Paraphrasing sort of. I don't care what religion you are, to be American is to be religious. Pick one and do it. That's what Americans do. Goes up to 70, 80%, throw in a little McCarthyism, right? You've got a good time. So you're right. When people are looking at that base and they're saying, oh my gosh, this is huge, what I talk about in choosing our religion is, no, this is a demographic correction, right? We know that even in the Middle Ages in Europe, church attendance, actual church attendance, people got fined for this. This is how we know. Church attendance, about 20%. About 20% of the population. Because people were always coming in to ask the priest, could he please, this happened with the cow, I had to deal with it, right? And even for people who were there, the middle of the Mass, right before the Hocus Pocus, right? That's where we get that, from when the Eucharist is up and the priest says, hoc est corpus, right? And the people have to turn around and look, right? They were playing cards and dice in the church. There weren't any pews till after the Reformation, right? So people are back there having a party, and the priest would say to the sexton, before the Hocus Pocus, go to the pubs and bring everybody back in. So even among that 20%, very small percentage, right? If you go to cathedrals in Europe, churches in Europe, you'll see graffiti all over, and it's bawdy, I mean, people are there. I mean, you'll see tick marks from people playing games, right? So we know that baseline, the thing that makes religious people go, oh my, whatever, right? Yeah, that's art. Again, the Hansen effect. We've been telling a story about our religiosity. The oldest person in my study was this guy named Jack. He was 85 when I interviewed him, and he just died last year, actually. He contacted me. His son was a conservative Methodist pastor in Overland Park, Kansas. Jack's wife had died recently, and the son was overdoing stuff. And I had written an article for a magazine about the religious unaffiliated, and the son was complaining about that and saying this crazy person is essentially saying it's okay for people to not be religious, that they actually won't, burst into flames. And he was upset. And Jack, who had come up in the early IBM world, was a tech guy, got himself on the computer, and he found me. And he wrote me an email, and he said, I'm 85 years old. I have never been a believer, and I've spent my whole life lying about it. He'd made an agreement with his wife when he married that he would never tell anyone that he was an atheist. And he said, so here I am at the end of my life. I've lost my wife, and my children don't know who I am as a real person. It was heartbreaking. It was just wrenching. So yeah, lots of people are in that Hansen 35% of their fibbing for 35, 40% fibbing for one reason or another. And so we really don't know. That doesn't mean that people don't have some kind of sense of something that transcends their, that's self-transcending. Doesn't have to be up there, right? It can be self-transcending in lots of ways. And I think one of the anxieties that people have now about calling themselves non-religious or even not spiritual is that there's not a language for talking about non-religious spiritualities or whatever. So one of the people I interviewed was a kid who, I'm sorry I'm talking too much, but one of the kids, I'll end on this and then ask more questions, was a kid who was one of our students actually, and he said, I'm an atheist, but I pray. I come here, I sit at the St. Clair Garden in Santa Clara, and I say that it's prayer. I don't believe that there's some supernatural being acting on my behalf but not on yours. It's not wishes I'm setting, it's just the language I have for it. It's a particular word that speaks to both fear and hope at the same time in a way that I'm thinking about you doesn't say, right? And so for traditions that don't have a lexicon for those kinds of complex experiences, it's really hard. And so people feel like I'm giving up my ability to talk about my experience if I say that I'm an atheist or I say that, I've heard people say that's why I say I'm an agnostic. It gives me a chance to kind of sneak something in. Other questions? Yes?
First of all, can you scoot back just a little?
Sure.
My real question is, I'm assuming most of your talk and the stats and all the information you gathered was mostly concerning the U.S.?
Yeah, it's all in the United States. Some of the people who participated in the survey were in other English-speaking countries in the world. I got some people from Canada and Australia, but my research is focused in the U.S.
Okay. The real question then is do you have any information comparing the U.S. to, for example, Europe? I've heard Europe is less religious than the United States. I'm just interested in if any information you have.
Yeah, it both is and isn't. The secularization process in Europe is very different and very tied with 18th century political movements, particularly the French Revolution. So the way in which secularism is encoded in political culture is very different than the way that sort of secularism is encoded in our Constitution and other governing rules, right, other governing documents. So yes, if you look at global data, people far more identify as non-religious and they're flying the flag high, right? They also really love hanging out at an old cathedral, right? So people still do ritual. People like having a space for ritual practice, right? We still have, people still have families, people still die, people still have births. They want to celebrate those. So those ritual spaces, that landscape is largely owned by religions. So you see lots of people, really high attendance at popular churches and cathedrals, but not for worship. Yeah. Yes?
Could you comment on the impact of internet in terms of, and your trends?
Yeah, huge, right? We know that the big, the first big free thought wave in the United States happens when, not just at the printing press, but when mass media, newspapers, become affordable for ordinary people, right? We get the Truth Seeker, and we get, all these kinds of magazine upon magazine, and that begins to allow people in far-flung places to connect in ways they never would have been able to, right? So you multiply that by the internet, and lots more. People are able to access information, and more importantly, they're able to access people. So if you were the village atheist, in Saratoga, whatever your neighborhood of that is, 50 years ago, you couldn't really find anybody else necessarily. You might know of them through newspapers and journals. Now you can find them, and we see people gathering all around the country. And I think that social aspect of it is actually more significant for many people than the informational aspect of it, because people have had access to certain amounts of information for some time. It's being able to verify that with other people, and to have people who can lead you to other places in your thinking. So yes, it's a huge part of that. I don't say that in front of religious groups a whole lot, because they always want to blame Facebook for non-religion. It's a little bit true, but it's also, how religion works. And I think that's really important, because even without the internet, even before we knew about unaffiliation, we knew about these kinds of dissatisfactions with religious practice as it was structured institutionally, that it didn't work within the confines of ordinary lives in lots of ways. So to put it all on the internet, I try not to do that, although that's been an empowering feature, certainly. You had a question back here?
Well, is there any way to separate the communication out from the scientific advancements? I mean, the God of the gaps has smaller gaps to fit into now. So are people more secular because there are other things to explain what's going on in the universe?
I mean, it's an all of the above kind of thing. You can't point to any one reason, right? Certainly people, after World War II, more ordinary people had access to education, right? That's a big deal. That's what happened, with Jack. He got to go to college and to graduate school, and, So, all these GI Bill people, so education, big deal, access to knowledge, and that knowledge was largely scientific, right? So yes, if you were thinking that, the Earth was created in 6,000, or has been around for 6,000 literal years, was created in 6 literal days and a day off, right? It's hard to sustain that. Like, you have to work at that. Right? I mean, 100 years ago, most of us would never have gone more than 10 miles from our home, right? We wouldn't have encountered a lot of different people. And I'm sad to say this, but most people in this room would be dead at this point, right? Until very early, until very late in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, like half of births ended with the death of the mother, the child, or both, right? You were lucky to make it past 50. In most places, life was short, brutal, even for the affluent, right? And so, you had little access to information. You didn't go very far. You worked really hard, and you were gonna die young. On that menu of life experiences, sorting out your philosophical approach to meaning making, probably not high on the list, right? And that's part of this identity fluidity that we're seeing now. If you're only going to live for 50 years, like, okay, I got a gender, I got a religion, I'm good. I'm just going with that, right? If you're going to live for, many people in this room will live well past 100, at least well past 90. If you're going to do that, your life is going to change in lots of different ways, and you throw some education into that and some information, you got a party, right?
Okay, we have one more right here.
Okay.
May we revisit, please, one of the early barcodes graphs? I was trying to interpret that, whether that was percentages or counts on the one with the above 30 or 35 and below 30 and 35. That one.
Okay.
All right. If you take the most recent year there, are those percentages?
Yes.
Because you take 35 from the most recent one from people under 30 plus 23% from people over 30, then that means a total of 58% everybody is...
No. It's too late in the day for me to do mathy things. but I can point you to the sources for it.
Or what
But
is the
this-
sample on that?
Off the top of my head, I don't know. It's from the Pew data and the General Social Survey.
Alrighty. Well, with that said, we'll have time for one more. Does anyone have a question? One last one? Sure.
I'm sorry, Dr. Drescher, people are not understanding that graph.
Yeah, I get it. I get it.
And what it is nuns. That is Pew Research data, at least for the more recent surveys, maybe not 1990, but the recent ones. The nuns are people who do not identify with any religious group. And those are now, 2015, 35% of people under age 30 do not identify with any religious group.
Right, they're not added. It's not cumulative. I'm sorry, I just got what you were asking.
Yes, and of people over 30, on average, 23% do not associate with any religious group and call themselves nuns. I do not identify with any religion. That's all.
Yeah, so they're not saying in the
They're
whole
not
population.
They're
So-
not additive, no.
Yeah. Now, one of the interesting things about this data, and I'll just wrap up on this, is that although people under age 30 are more likely to be religiously unaffiliated, because math, obviously my strong suit, but because math, there are more people who are over age 30 who are religiously unaffiliated because there are more people over age 30 in the United States, right? And so where people are often very concerned about how are young people making this change? What does that mean? Actually, there's a lot of us, right, in that cohort. In fact, even more, just a slower growth rate. So, yeah. And then I'm going to go.
And we should point out, when you say under age 30, the surveys are only of adults. That is people 18 and above. We're not talking about children here.
Right, right.
So we're only talking about, the first group is people 18 to 30, and the second group is age 31 and older.
Right. Alrighty. Well,
Sorry.
I was just going to say thank you very much for your good questions and your time.
Alrighty. So I'm doing so. Okay. All right, everyone. Sorry.